So welcome, Andrew, to this talk series. So Andrew Ofstehage is a postdoctoral associate at Cornell University in the Development Sociology Department. Before this, he completed a PhD in anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And his research is among transnational soybean farmers in Brazil, and it incorporates his training in agronomy and anthropology to ask questions about how these farmers engage with soils and landscapes in Brazil, how they become managers of workers and at the same time investors, and how they create and recreate agrarian communities out of place in new places. So he's now also conducting new research on the biocultural life of soy consumptions in the United States and planning additional work. He's got a couple of book manuscripts. One is I recently learned, currently under review, and it addresses how American farmers encounter ecologies, communities, and infrastructure of soy production in Brazil, and how businesses and farming practices in Brazil are becoming farming models for other parts of the world. He's also preparing another book about the future of food, which involves ethnographic analysis of, among other things, Soylent and right-wing Reddit channels, which I was actually just visiting after our conversation. It's looking pretty fascinating. So thanks a lot, Andrew, for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to the talk.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. That was wonderful. So today I'll be presenting a comparative ethnography of two groups of transnational soybean farmers in Brazil. They're both from the United States. They migrated at different times, one in the 1960s and one in the early 2000s. And you'll see they're engaging with the same kind of process of soy cultivation in Brazil, but in much different ways and sometimes very similar ways. And I think unpacking those differences can tell us a lot about the power of capital, the power of the ecology of the Cerrado, the part of Brazil that they're doing this in, and the power of the soy boom itself, but also the importance of culture and livelihoods and values and community at stake. So first, just a little background. I started my research career in Bolivia, studying quinoa markets and quinoa production there. That was in the light of the quinoa boom of the early 2000s through 2010s, in which a lot of people were saying, well, quinoa is either, this increase in quinoa prices is either starving Bolivian farmers who can no longer afford to keep quinoa for themselves to eat, or it's making these quinoa farmers wealthy. And I was interested in how these farmers are dealing with these new markets, how they're dealing with multiple buyers, including farmer cooperatives, intermediaries, international buyers, but also how they're changing production practices or not changing production practices. And what I found, not necessarily surprisingly, was that these farmers were responding to these international markets, but they were also managing multiple commodity chains. So they were connecting to farmer cooperatives out of a sense of loyalty. They were connecting with intermediaries who gave them lower prices, but offered credit and exchange of goods for quinoa instead of cash, which was difficult to get some of these goods in these extremely rural parts of Bolivia. And that they were telling stories about the way they were farming that gave themselves cultural and social significance in saying that we produce quinoa the best. You know, our quinoa is the best, which connected to these markets and to the soil, but also to social values and community. So when I did this research, I realized it wasn't necessarily surprising. People expect small-scale quinoa farmers who are farming agroecologically to have social values of production. And for my PhD research, I wanted to ask some of these same questions about commodity booms and the importance of values and the importance of culture and of ecologies in a much different place. So I turned to first family farmers from the United States who migrated to the Brazilian Cerrado to start 30,000, 10,000 hectare soybean fields, soybean farms. So massive, massive farms. And I was interested in how this kind of extremely capitalized, extremely commodified farm production might have space for culture, might have space for different social values, for social reproduction, for community reproduction, and really for difference, right? While I was doing that research, I became aware of a Mennonite colony who migrated in the 1960s, who were also from the US originally, and they were in Brazil farming soybeans. And of course, Mennonites come from a much different cultural background, even if they're coming from the same country. They were there for different amount, you know, they're there for 3 generations, while the other group has been there for 1 generation, and not really even that, because now they're coming back to the US. So this other community offered me a lens in which to explore some of these questions in a comparative way, to see where these 2 communities are converging, where they're becoming more similar and adopting similar practices, adopting different similar business practices, but also possibly where they're becoming more different, right? Where they're going in different pathways. And then I might get to this at the end of the presentation, but my new work is on the biosocial life of soy in the United States, looking through the way soylence is marketed as kind of a nutritional delivery system, not a food, but something that delivers nutrition to your body and allows you to survive while you work at your desk or play video games or whatever. And the frame of soy boys, which is a right-wing discourse, which frames men, mostly white men, as being victims of having too much soy, which has phytoestrogens, which makes them feminized, which makes them politically liberal. So it's a lot of steps that they're taking in that formulation, but it's interesting nonetheless in terms of how they're taking the material qualities of soybeans and you know, building from that to give it kind of social meaning, a greater kind of political meaning, and saying soybeans are everything. They define your gender, they define your politics. So let's start with Soy India. So this is a Texan farm worker driving an Illinois-made tractor on land owned by an Illinois farm owner in the center of Brazil. This was a picture I took while flying from Luis Eduardo Magalhães, the capital of agribusiness, where most of these farmers live, to the farm, which was about 3 hours away by car and about 30 minutes away by plane. And it's very common for farmers to live in the city and go out to their farm a few times a week, or even a lot of Brazilian farmers in the area live in São Paulo and come once a month or once a week or something like that. So flying through the sky, looking at this massive field, seeing this massive tractor really that looked like just a speck on this field, really brought to my attention how different this was than what we usually think when we think of a farm, right? This is a completely different world where people are flying to their fields, they're visiting them a few times a week, and there's all these kind of international, transnational connections. So this is representative of the first group of Midwestern family farmers who migrated in the early 2000s. I'll explain the reasons for that in a bit, but they're located in Western Bahia. You can see Bahia in this shadow, this grayed state here, and they're just on the western border of that, the very, very farthest western border of there. And this is a much different view, right? This is from the ground, looking out on a landscape that is a working landscape. It's not just fields, it's not just flat production forever. You can see forest, you can see pond, you can see livestock in the distance, and a sink for people to wash their dirty hands, which are actually getting dirty through doing farming. This is from a 3rd generation Mennonite farm in southwestern Goiás, just a state away from Bahia, and the state is located also in the Cerrado of Brazil. So here, farms looked much more familiar to me. I grew up on a small scale farm in South Dakota in the United States, and this looked like a farm to me. There was family living on the farm. They were doing their own work. They weren't depending on farm workers. But at the same time, they're engaging with the same kind of process of the soy boom and Soylandia. The Holdeman Mennonites, this picture actually isn't from the Holdeman farm, but from down the road from where the Mennonites lived. it's a group of about 70 families of Mennonites who've been there since 1968. And now are the third generation. Most of them still farm, but some of them work in the city of Rio Verde in service industries, and some of them do dirt working. And I'll explain the reasons for that later in this presentation. So one big idea I try to engage with my work is this idea of the soy boom. And usually we hear about this in the frame of Soylandia, of the United Republic of Soy, of soyization, and it refers to this large-scale homogenization of soy economies, of soy landscapes, of soy farming and business practices, in which things are just becoming the same. Like things are becoming like Soylandia, like the United Republic of Soy. And we hear discourse from proponents of the soy boom that this is producing economic growth. And we hear from opponents that it's destroying ecologies and it's destroying communities of people. What I wanted to find out is to the extent to which this homogenization is happening, and to what extent there's some space in between these ideas of this is creating economic development and it's a good thing, and this is destructive and it's a terrible thing. And I think in treating this space as not, a single space, single kind of process, but looking at difference and looking at trajectories and looking at spaces for change, we can start to give some nuance to this idea of the soy boom. So here you can see in this image the transformation of Western Bahia. So 1979, you can see it's grassland. 1986, you're seeing some more soybean fields. 2000, by 2005, it's completely taken over by corn and cotton and soybean fields. And this is taking place primarily in Brazil. The expansion of soybean production is happening in the Cerrado, primarily in the Mapitoba states of Maranhão, Piauí, Bahia, and Tocantins. And the Cerrado is a place of rich narration and discourse. Agronomists from Iowa State in the US said the Cerrado is a wasteland with stunted twisted trees. The Cerrados are not rainforests. So the Cerrado is nothing, right? The Cerrado is something that's just waiting to be developed, made into something better. Workers in the Japanese Development Organization said Brazil achieved an epoch-making breakthrough to become a net exporter of grain by converting barren land into one of the most productive agricultural areas. So again, the Cerrado is something that has potential, right? The Cerrado isn't something that's valued in itself, but it is something that has potential to become something better, to be transformed into soybean production space, and therefore a place that people will move to and a place that's productive for the national GDP. You also see from Brazilian ecologists this view that the Cerrado is a rich and generally unappreciated biodiversity. The number of vascular plants exceed that of most floras in the world. So here talking about the Cerrado is something to be protected. But of course, there's a third viewpoint in which the Cerrado is neither something to be transformed nor something to be protected, coming from the dweller of the Cerrado, saying the Cerrado is where we hunt. So in this case, the Cerrado is not something that needs to be done something to, right? It's not something that needs to be protected for itself, and it's not something that needs to be transformed into something better. But it's a place where we live. It's a place where agriculture happens, where ceremonies happen, where people play. And it's not just a thing to be changed or protected, but a place that people live. And here you can see how closely soybean production maps onto the Cerrado. Each red dot on this map represents 10,000 tons of soybean production. And here you can see my field sites in Rio Verde, Brasilia, and Luis Eduardo Magalhães. So with my work, I was trying to answer three main questions. First, how do we understand commodity booms anthropologically? And I did this through a kind of a lens of mobility and migration to understand why farmers are migrating. And I found in both cases are migrating due to some kind of crisis at home. And in both cases, this going to the frontier didn't really fix the problem. It just pushed the problem a little bit down the road. It made it a problem for different people. So just to jump ahead a little bit, the family farmers migrated because of land inaccessibility. They went to Brazil where they made land more inaccessible, right? So they're just moving the problem. The Mennonites migrated to get space for themselves to reproduce the community and reproduce their culture, and in so doing, contribute to the growth of that place and brought more people there, which threatened their ability to have that kind of semi-autonomy. So basically, in both cases, they're trying to solve it, but they're reproducing the same problems that they are escaping. Also, how do we understand value in terms of transnational industrial agriculture? And how are these rural communities reconstituted? In both cases, I find that the migrant groups are recreating community value, but they're doing so in relation with their work, right? They're doing so in relation with their capital flows, in relation with their engagement with the ecology, and the relationship with Brazilian people in the places they're working, and with people back at home in the United States. And then finally, how do we understand the social and ecological elements of farming and how they relate to each other? And in both cases, again, we see the farmers are engaging with soil and plants and pests, as well as capital and regulations and national laws. And so they're not just destroying, but they're actually creating new kinds of ways of engaging with soil, new kinds of ways of engaging with soy, new ways of doing business. So the work in some ways is generative, and generative doesn't necessarily mean positive, right? It's not necessarily a good thing, but they are creating new things in this work. My work built on three kind of overarching methodologies. One was ethnography. So I was doing a lot of participant observation and ethnographic interviewing. A lot of my work was in pickup trucks with farmers, just talking while we went to the farm and listening how they engage with their workers and that kind of thing. And some of it was questions that I had. Some of it was just idle talk that revealed a lot about how they saw themselves and the Cerrado in that place. It was also comparative ethnography, and again, I wasn't trying to look for similarities and differences between two groups of people in stasis, but rather two groups of people who had trajectories before this happened, before they went to Brazil, and who have trajectories into the future after this happens. So they're not the same. They're not, they're not singular communities that are homogenous within themselves, but they're two groups of people who are changing in relationship with each other and with Brazil and with soybeans and with home communities. And finally, as a transnational ethnography, I was moving between space, but also particularly with the family farmers in Western Bahia, I was doing sometimes Skype interviews and Facebook chats and messages and that kind of thing, because a lot of times these farmers, even though I was in Brazil, they weren't in Brazil. A lot of times they were in Illinois or Iowa with family there, managing the farm through email and through Skype and that kind of thing. So my work had to go beyond face-to-face interactions into like using Skype, using Facebook, and this kind of thing. So my work consisted of reviewing kind of farmland value in the United States to understand the context of farmland and accessibility in the US, looking at soil data in Brazil and how these farmers were, what their kind of ecological situation they were engaging with, and mostly ethnographic research in Goiás and Bahia in the US, in which I interviews, some which were career histories, some were semi-structured interviews, dozens of farm visits in the Mennonite community and the family farmer community, and a lot of participant observation, a lot of hanging out with these farmers and writing down as much as I could about what I saw. So I'm going to start with the family farmers because that's where my research started. Just to set this up a little bit, it's always been a challenge for me in describing these two groups of people, right? Because the Mennonites, some of them primarily identify as Mennonites, some of them identify as Americans, some identify as Christians, and some identify as Brazilians. So to call them Mennonites is to kind of pave over these differences in how they identify themselves, but it's easy, right? It's clear. And again, the family farmers in Bahia, of course, the Mennonite farmers are also family farmers, but you just have to stick with me. This is kind of the best solution I've come to this identification problem. So that when I talk about family farmers, they are corporate farmers as well. They are also transnational farmers. So it's not this kind of typical family farm that you might be imagining, but they do describe themselves as family farmers. So these farmers came mostly from family farms in the United States. And they were waiting basically to take over their family farms. And they didn't want to wait that long. They couldn't also purchase land in the United States because land was too expensive. And they didn't want to go into massive debt for not only the land, but also machinery and that kind of thing. And so a lot of these farmers talked about the financial economic opportunities of farming in Brazil, but they also talked about continuing farming traditions, engaging with farm work, creating a farm that they could pass on to their kids. And in almost every interview, people were talking about the first immigrant from Europe that came to the United States and had a farm in Idaho or Illinois or whatever, and made this connection, although they didn't talk about settler colonialism, but connecting to this settler colonial history of migration and transforming grassland prairie to agricultural land associated with the concomitant, dispossession of indigenous people from their lands. So they didn't talk about it that way, but they talked about this tradition of migration and farming. So mostly what they were doing in Brazil was trying to find cheaper land, cheaply paid workers, and kind of an opportunity to make money, but also to get back into farming. And they did this by adopting what I call a flexible farming strategy, which engages with flexible land, flexible crops, and flexible work. And I'll talk through each one of these in turn. So first, flexible land. These farmers didn't buy necessarily 30,000 hectares of land right away, but they bought 5,000 hectares and then another 6,000 hectares and then another 10,000 hectares. They pretty quickly built this land up, right? But how do you farm a 30,000 hectare farm? One thing that makes it possible is simplified landscapes. So these fields are extremely flat topographically. They're also extremely homogeneous in terms of soil. So this allows the farmers to say, for this 10,000 hectare field, we're going to plant this variety of soybeans. We're going to spray glyphosate on May 18th or whatever, and we're going to spray fungicide on this date. And you can make these decisions simplified, right? Because there is one kind of agroecology, one kind of soil, one kind of climate, one kind of topography for this whole field, and it simplifies these farming practices. What also makes it possible is the fact that the production isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is, or not necessarily the most important thing, but the production of these fields is at an equal level of speculation. So what's important isn't that they get the maximized yield out of these fields, but rather that they develop the land and the farm in a way that makes it appeal to farmland investors. So they do this by building a farm. They do this by changing the soil pH and changing the soil fertility. They do this by building roads and getting land titles clarified and legalized and all that stuff. And being situated at the frontier of soybean production, they're able to buy Cerrado land, which is grassland, to kind of savanna land, and make it into an agricultural field, build this infrastructure up, and then sell it at a massive profit. So what makes it possible to produce is the fact that it's not just for production. And then the third thing that makes this possible is that they really don't have a social family connection to this land. A lot of these farmers are going back and forth between the US and Brazil. A lot of them talked about continuing family farming traditions, but this land, these pieces of land weren't necessarily important to the farmer. If they had a better deal, they would sell this land. If they were able to take over the family farm in the US, they would sell this farm and move back. So unlike some farms in the United States, where people name a field after their family member or after a topographical feature or something like this, these are really just assets ready to be sold. There's no kind of social connection. So they also use flexible crops. And you might be wondering why I have a picture of cotton instead of soybean here. Cotton is something most of these farmers have never seen before, but Western Bahia is kind of perfect conditions for cotton production, because there's a lot of rainfall when they need rainfall, and then rain shuts off for a while, which produces really high quality cotton. But cotton is really hard to grow. In kind of typical paternalistic masculine discourse, a lot of the farmers will talk about soy is a crop for a boy and cotton is a crop for a man. And they say this because it requires a more intense kind of fertilization. It takes more pesticide application because any kind of damage to that plant affects the value of the cotton as well. It's not just about the yield, but it's about the quality of the cotton itself. And they also have to, it's an annual crop, or it's a perennial crop, so they have to plow it over every year to make space for other crops for the next year. So this is not a flexible crop. Soybeans are much more flexible and preferred by these farmers because it takes less fertilization, it takes less pesticides and insecticides, even though it takes quite a lot, it takes less. But there's also more markets for it, right? Like cotton goes to one kind of textile industry, whereas soy can go to international markets, domestic markets. It can be made into feed for animals. It can be made into food for humans. It could be made into soy oil, anything like that. So the characteristics of soy make it flexibly interchange into this kind of production practice, which they prefer because they don't want to, they want to be able to respond quickly to market forces. But the other thing that makes soy ideal for these farmers is that, or makes it fit into their kind of farming system, is none of these farmers identify as like soybean farmers. In Bolivia, when I was working with quinoa farmers, they identified as quinoa farmers, and they were proud of being quinoa farmers and their relation with quinoa. And I've seen in some studies, the importance of corn farming to Iowa farmers, or the importance of being soybean farmers to Paraguayan farmers. But when I asked farmers how they decided what to plant that year, they say, well, whatever the market calls for. So there's no kind of social connection again. There's no kind of ecological connection even to having a rotation that responds to pest problems or anything like this. It's basically connected to the availability of markets and the prices available for this crop. So, and then additionally, this is all GMO soybeans, right? So having that means that they don't have to use integrated pest management. They don't have to really engage with the soy plants and pests. They can just spray, at least for weeds, they can spray just glyphosate once every couple of weeks and not worry about it. So it simplifies. Anything that can simplify on a 30,000 hectare farm is helpful. And then finally, flexible work makes this all possible as well. None of these farmers, before they got to Brazil, had farm workers, but they quickly learned that they couldn't manage these massive farms without farm workers. So they hired 100 to 150 workers, and the way they manage those workers, but also the work of the farmers themselves becomes flexible. So the farms themselves become mostly office workers, right? They work 60% of their time in an office doing paperwork, filing documents with the government, managing investors back in the United States and writing investor reports and communicating with new investors and trying to court new investment, because none of these are self-funded. They're all funded through local investors in the US. So their work becomes alienated from the farm in a way. So it's flexibilized from the farm. It's not rooted in the soil, in agriculture. They go to these farms to talk to the workers and manage the workers, but they're not actually managing the soil. They're not managing the plants, really. Their work becomes really alienated, not only from the field, but also from the farm. They could be doing this from Illinois. They could be doing this from Iowa and not have a problem. But they also flexibilize the farm workers themselves. So while managers, so like agronomists and worker managers, and even accountants are sought after employees, the way that these farmers talk about farm workers themselves is as interchangeable, uneducated cogs in a machine that could be replaced by anybody. So unlike what we think of like a plantation, where there is violent relationships between the workers and the farmers, but at least a long-term kind of connection, there's no kind of give and take in this relationship. It's basically, we need this many workers. And it doesn't matter if these are the same workers as last year or as last season, we'll get new workers because they're all uneducated, they're all unskilled, even though we disagree with that. That's how the farmers talked about it. And so farmers would create, like this is a picture of a mission vision for a farm, which you wouldn't necessarily expect for a farm. But the farmer talked about it as a way to clarify the goals and the values of the farm, so that when he was away, the farm workers could say, oh, okay, so we need to think about, profitability and efficiency and that kind of thing, instead of, our own worker rights or our own preferences or values or anything like that. So the work on these farms is flexible for both the farmer and is made flexible for the farm worker in terms of being kind of a cog in the machine. So there's just a couple notes on the community, because when we talk about land grabs and large scale soybean production, we don't usually talk about community. Stemming, I think, from competition over land and over investors, this community was extremely antagonistic. I was there during Thanksgiving one year, and I had competing Thanksgiving invitations. So they don't actually like get together, but they have like competing kind of social groups within the community, and they kind of like backstab. They talk to each other's investors and say, well, so and so hasn't planted yet, or so and so has too many weeds in their field, or so and so is messing up their bookkeeping, that kind of thing. And so this intense competition, which I think stems from the competition over land and capital in Brazil, but also from the personalities that they brought into it. It takes a certain kind of person to want to create a 30,000 hectare farm in Brazil. And that same kind of set of values plays into this kind of antagonism within the community. So I wasn't brought into a place where everybody wanted to contribute, but rather everybody kind of wanted to tell me the different rumors about each other, which was, as an ethnographer, quite helpful, because they wanted to tell like each other's dirt or whatever. But it's not like a friendly community. So despite their work to make farming flexible, there are certain things that made this impossible or difficult. First is the white flag. So starting in like 2003, soybean rust arrived in Brazil. That was a huge problem for a couple of years, but then farmers realized they could just use fungicide at a certain application rate and a certain time, and they could control it. It was expensive, but they could control soybean rust. White fly can only really be controlled through integrated pest management. There's no pesticides, there's no insecticides that really address it. And using integrated pest management would go against all of the simplification that we've talked about. It's more intensive management, more careful management of fields. And so the white fly is really reducing yields, really reducing productivity, and they don't really have an answer unless they change the way they farm. So this is calling them to engage more closely with pests and the soy plants, which again, it's against their strategy. Second, they expected, I think, to be able to develop in their terms and correct in their terms the soil of the Cerrado, but they're learning that it takes this kind of constant engagement, especially with cotton production. So they have to add a certain amount of fertilizer every year. They have to do soil tests. They have to do kind of banded fertilizer instead of just mass applying fertilizer. So this kind of constant attention and care that needs to be done with the soils and say how to call into their attention, make them have to maintain this land and maintain this soil, which again is going against this kind of easy flexibility of land management. They want to just sell this land for speculative profit, but in the meantime, they have to engage with the soil every year. And then finally, as of 2010, Brazil started enforcing the foreign land law, which all the land that they already had was grandfathered in, but they couldn't buy new land. And so, of course, again, this threatens their speculative strategy and makes it impossible to buy new land in order to sell more land later on. And at the same time, investors back home still have a say in how these farms are run. So these farmers are maintaining this flexible strategy, but they can only do so much on their own. They have to have the investor buy-in. They have to have investors approve of of their large scale decisions. If they're going to sell a piece of land, the investors have to agree. So they can't just do things on their own. So now we'll transition to the Holdeman Mennonites in Goiás. So in the 60s, the mid 60s in the US, there's three things that concern the Holdeman Mennonites. Holdeman Mennonites are a little strange for Mennonites in that they're evangelical, which means they're trying to reach out to other groups and bring people into the community, into the church, which is unusual. And they're extremely conservative in terms of like engagement with the outside world, like with the worldly world of the rest of us. So the three things that concerned them was first the Vietnam War draft. They're pacifists and they didn't want to join the war and have to fight in the war. Second, a Supreme Court decision that they interpreted as saying they would have to teach sex education and evolution in their classrooms, and it would threaten their ability to decide how much and what kind of education their children would receive. And then third, the growing ubiquity of television concerned their ability to not only reproduce their community, but also exclude worldly influences, other influences. Some of them also talked about farmland prices and that kind of thing, but it was these cultural, religious concerns that drew them to Brazil. So they toured rural Brazil, and in Goiás, they found basically pasture land that most people said wasn't very fertile and couldn't be used for soybean production. But on their way to Mato Grosso, which they heard would be like better soil, a river was flooded. And they took this as a sign that they shouldn't go any further. They came back to Rio Verde and bought 10,000 hectares of land. So that was distributed among 8 families at the beginning. And then over time, whenever a Mennonite family would come down, one of them would sell land to that person. So it's not communal land, it's not collective land, but it is kind of a bank of land for that community, which they divide every time somebody comes down or every time there's a new, a child takes over a piece of land or something like that. So they're in Brazil, not necessarily to produce soy, because soy wasn't produced in that part of the country at that time, but rather just to find space for social reproduction and semi-autonomy. So unsurprisingly, this group pursued fixed farming to fix themselves and the agriculture and the families and the community in place, things that bound them to the land. Instead of alienating themselves from the land, bound them to these things. So I'll talk about each of these in turn: fixed land, fixed crops, and fixed work. So fixed the land. So they started with this 10,000 hectares and quickly started parceling it out among families. As of my research time, it was 70 families. So, this land had been divided quite a lot, but also sometimes farmers would sell to outside communities. So selling to Brazilian farmers in the area. So as of the time of the research, the land base in this community had become a serious concern. And so there's certain ways that they are fixed to the land. First of all, we talked about the homogeneity of the land in Western Bahia. And here, that's not really the case. Here, there's a lot of hills, there's a lot of differences in the soil from one part of the farm to the other part of the farm. There's differences in this hillside to that hillside. And farmers do respond to those changes. So they might plant soy in one part of the field and hay in another part of the field in order to capitalize on these differences in agroecology. So they can't make these big, large-scale decisions apply to large pieces of land. They have to respond to the differences in the land. But moving past that, there's two kind of mechanisms that these farmers use to control land, to fix land in place. First of all, this kind of soft power of kind of disapproving of anybody who sells land outside the community. So they don't really punish anybody. They don't really, there's not real consequences, but people will talk about you behind their back, and people will say, oh, so-and-so is not really one of us, or so-and-so is sacrificing the community in order to make some money, that kind of thing. But the second more powerful mechanism is that if you accumulate too much land, let's say 250 hectares, I don't think there's a real number, but if you accumulate too much land, which is about 200 to 250 hectares, you'll be excommunicated from the religion and from the community, which means you can no longer go to church, you can't send your kids to the school, you can't have lunch with the people, you can't really be part of the community at all. So your choice becomes either complete social isolation in the community or going somewhere else. And it's not an immediate process. It's something that they'll talk to you and they'll have meetings with you and say, well, we're concerned that you're putting profit and prestige in front of your family, in front of your community, in front of God. But if that farmer persists in having that much land, then that farmer will be excommunicated along with their family. So fixed crops. This is a much different scene, right, than massive soybean farms. Where the farmers in Western Bahia didn't care what they plant as long as it makes money. These farmers cared deeply about what the impacts of their production decisions were. So for example, in this farm, they had livestock. And the reason for that was to teach the kids on the farm, responsibility and how to take care of animals and how to make some money and that kind of thing. Another farmer talked about not growing hay because he was concerned that hay was only used for horse owners, and horse owning to him was a leisurely activity. It wasn't productive, it wasn't useful. And so he didn't want to really participate in that realm. He wanted to produce something that was productive for society, and so he didn't produce hay. So they produced only things that they felt like were contributing to the community, contributing to the world in which they wanted to see materialize. Farmers also wouldn't engage with the local farmers cooperative because they thought it was too aggressive. It wasn't pacifistic enough because it represented power, it represented farmers against other entities, right? It brought people together and created a kind of political power, and they didn't support that. So they're producing things that make money and allow them to continue farming livelihoods, but never more than necessary, which we'll talk in the next slide. So going into Brazil, I'd heard a lot about Holdeman Mennonites and Gelassenheit. Gelassenheit is this idea of like doing hard work on earth in order to express your devotion to God, and therefore gaining God's favor on earth and in the afterlife. So I went to Goiás asking all these farmers, all these Mennonites about Gelassenheit and hard work and how important hard work was. And finally, one of the farmers said, Andrew, I don't know why do you keep asking about farm work or hard work? Because like my brother works in the printing press at the colony. He doesn't farm. Do you think that's not hard work? Or do you think that's hard work or not? And he explained to me that for them, what was important more than religious faith, more than being a Christian, was supporting your family for a man, I suppose. And it was extremely gendered society. So the person who's supporting the family is the man in their world. So work, it was important to meet that kind of threshold of supporting your family, but it was always also important to not exceed that threshold, right? It was important that you're not doing too much work or too much profit making, so that you would gain too much money and lose kind of focus of your family, lose focus of God, lose focus of devotion to these things. So, if somebody had a brand new pickup or a brand new tractor, people would talk to them and say, hey, we're concerned maybe that you're putting too much focus on these things, like this materiality and profit and these things, and not enough on your family. Even if somebody wore like brightly colored clothing, like a bright red shirt or something, they would talk to them and say, well, we're concerned that you're putting these material, worldly things in front of what's important. So hard work wasn't necessarily important in itself, but working towards your family, working for the community were inherently valuable. Those are to the people I talked to, these were the most valuable things for them to be doing. And so they didn't use farm workers, they didn't use technology either. They complained about their neighboring Brazilian farmers and American farmers in Western Bahia as being tied to the satellite, meaning they couldn't do their work without GPS technology. They couldn't do their work without technology. They were tied to these things. They were dependent on technology to do the work. They couldn't do it themselves. Whereas the Mennonites, unspokenly, could do that work. They were the real kind of farmers, right? Which is something my father was a farmer. He would agree with that statement. It's not a uniquely Mennonite idea that real farming is being in the field, that kind of thing. So this community, in some ways, was much more collaborative and coherent and together, right? Like they had their own school system, they had their own churches, they got together, they had work committees to work on roads, and people in Rio Verde talked about the American roads being really good. So like there were ways that they really got together, but there were definitely cleavages. So Brazilians who came into the colony, remember they're evangelical, were part of the community and could purchase land within the community, but they were always kind of second-class Mennonites, right? Like people always question, like, well, did this person join our community because they believe, or because they thought they could, become as wealthy as we are, or because they wanted to benefit from relationships with Americans or with Mennonites? So there's always this kind of second-class idea of Brazilian Mennonites in the colony. There's also extremely violent relationships with LGBT students, or not students, people in the community. So if it turned out, so there's a story, I was riding in a pickup with a Mennonite, and he was talking about a community member who had killed a pastor in the community. And he talked about him as kind of going off of this path, kind of like a very forgiving kind of idea, like of making a mistake, but he could be kind of redeemed. And the next moment he talked about a gay boy in the community who had been excommunicated, and saying, like, there's no place for that boy. So for me, this is a really sad and terrifying kind of juxtaposition of, like, a murder could be forgiven, but a gay person couldn't be, obviously not forgiven, but like couldn't be accepted. So there were extremely strong mechanisms for maintaining the community and maintaining the land, but this is definitely at the cost of certain groups of people in the community who would not be accepted and kicked out of their homes. So despite this group's efforts towards flexibility or fixity, there were places where they had to adopt flexible farming strategies. So as of the early 2000s, these farmers mostly saved seed from year to year, and they had mostly the same farming practices they developed in the late 60s and early 70s. But they were kind of forced to compete with Brazilian farmers who came from the south of Brazil into that area and brought new farming strategies with them. So in order to compete, they adopted buying hybrid seed and GMO seed. They adopted safrinha, which is like a second crop. So you plant soybeans first and then afterwards corn to follow up. And they adopted using more pesticides and this kind of thing in order to compete. So it wasn't necessarily to make money for itself, but in order to help that community survive. Second, despite their efforts to keep land fixed in the community, they were losing a land base. And so to address this, they are creating new communities in Tocantins and Mato Grosso, two other Brazilian states, where land is cheaper. And so here's a case where in order to keep that colony going, and in order to keep this community going, they're changing it inherently, right? They're creating a different community, moving to a different place. So it's this kind of continuity by change process. And so they're having to basically commodify kind of land, basically change farming practices in order to keep that farm community going. So my conclusions, kind of broad conclusions, are that the soy boom is an uneasy kind of assemblage of these different flows of capital, of communities, of ecologies. It's not a thing, right? Like, it's not a single thing. It's something that's produced constantly and changed constantly as flows of capital change, as people involved in the soybean change, and it also changes them, right? Like these groups of farmers aren't the same as when they entered. They're not the same people. They're adopting new farming strategies, they're adopting new business strategies. So they're changing the soybean as the soybean is also changing them. Second, the assemblage is generating new kinds of ecologies, new farmers, and new models of farming, not just destroying them, but it's generating new ways of engaging with soybean production and farming in general. And then third, these points of divergence and convergence tell us a little bit about, what needs to be responded to, right? Like it tells us the kind of the power of the soy boom in terms of practices that need to be adopted, of capital engagement that needs to be adopted, and places where difference can exist, spaces for difference, right? And so that difference makes a difference, right? So in terms of the landscape and growing conditions, there's differences in Rio Verde and in Western Bahia that make a difference in how they can engage with soybean production. There's difference in capital, right? So the farmers in Western Bahia have to respond to investor demands and investment capital. The Mennonites have to respond to competition from Brazilian farmers, but it's a different kind of relation with capital. And there's also this importance of business plans and culturally defined priorities and values and community reproduction that's also at play. And it's different kinds of community, different kinds of reproduction. But in both cases, they're trying to reproduce something through soybean production. And a question that I'm still trying to address through this comparison is, does it really make a difference, right? Like whether these values are different or the practices are different, the scales are different, there's still deforestation, right? There's still dispossession of indigenous groups. There's still, the concretization of the soy boom process, even if there's difference. And that's something I'm still looking through, and maybe y'all can help me think through that. So just quickly, next steps. I'm still, as Jan mentioned, my book, Welcome to Soylandia, is under review. So I'll be working through that, getting that through publication. But I'm still thinking of new research in terms of this kind of spread of the industrial mode of soybean production through possibly new research with cultural knowledge exchange between American and Brazilian farmers. I'm also thinking through new research with the Mennonites and looking at these new communities that are creating in Tocantins and Mato Grosso in terms of differences with the kind of core community in Rio Verde and what kind of life they're creating. So the community in Tocantins is mostly exiled, excommunicated farmers who were part of the Mennonite community and no longer are. And the farmers in Mato Grosso are kind of directly sent to represent that community. Then finally, new research on soylents and soy boys. I can talk more through this if there's any questions, but basically looking through not only the social life of these of soy consumption, but the material aspects of soy that play into part of this. So for the soy boys, the fact that there are phytoestrogens and this creates meaning for certain people, concerns for certain people, which scientifically are not valid, but are valid in terms of how they imagine the world. And for soylent, the fact that the soybean has this nutrition in it and allows it to become part of this mixture of minerals and vitamins and things. And there's also a clear connection between the way soylent is imagined and the way it's marketed as a more efficient crop. So they talk about being pro-GMO and the fact that their main kind of food in their product is made on mass scales, industrial scales. And so if you buy soylent, it's better for the world because you can just produce it all on this kind of factory farm and take it direct to market. So you don't have to mess around with family farms and agroecology and that kind of stuff. So it's a clear way of imagining a world in which efficiency, but not taste or culture or ecological sustainability are in any way important. All right, thank you.